government will invest over $25 billion in the early childhood education and care sector. Now, why do I point that out? Because that is more than triple the amount that was invested in the same 4-year period under the previous government. Now, if anybody in this room can name a single portfolio area where their budget has been tripled over just over 5 years, I would challenge you to put it forward, because I don't believe that there is one. And I believe that this absolutely does show our commitment to the sector and the fact that we are willing to invest heavily in this area. Now, of course, we've had a number of different focuses. On coming to government, we were adamant that we needed to address the issue of affordability. And we talked about the fact that we've increased the rebate from 30 to 50%. Importantly, we increased the cap on the rebate from $4,354. I think I've said that figure far too many times in my life, up to $7,500 per year per child. And I would point out that whilst we have agreed to a cap and pause measure to keep it at that level, that was a measure that was actually supported by the opposition in the Parliament, and the Leader of the Opposition has supported all of the savings measures in the budget. So I don't think we should say one thing in the Parliament and another thing to the people who work in the sector. We've done that because we know that less than 10% of the population will reach that cap. And we've done it because we know that there are other areas where we absolutely need to be investing our resources. And we could talk about the budget-based funded services, the infrastructure upgrades, the professional wages. There are a range of other areas where we believe they need to be key priorities too. So we've made some decisions around that. But what we do know is that in terms of affordability, we have ensured that your average family is spending less of their disposable income on their childcare fees now than they were when we came to government. And I think that's really important. We also know that since we introduced fortnightly payments and indeed quarterly payments, we are now at the point where over 80% of Australian families who started receiving the rebate after we introduced fortnightly payments are now opting for that measure. That means 80% of families right now are already having their fees paid directly to their childcare centres on a fortnightly basis. That is what's happening already. But what we also know is that since we increased affordability assistance and so massively increased the fee assistance for Australian families, we have seen a surge in demand. Far from the cries of people fleeing the system and right across the nation, far from the cries of people not being able to afford childcare, so that there's been this mass exodus, you would know better than anyone, because you have the job of answering the phone and speaking to the people who are on numerous waiting lists, who are probably ringing continually saying, do I have a place yet, do I have a place yet? And I can only imagine how hard that is. We have seen a surge in the demand for childcare and an increase in services. We released some figures today which I thought were interesting about New South Wales. In New South Wales, we now have 100,000 more children accessing care. The number of children in care in New South Wales has grown 41% between 2007 and 2012. I would say that is far from fleeing from the sector. Compared to that 41%, it grew by only 12% during the previous 6 years under the previous government. We know that there are now 5,180 childcare services in New South Wales, which is a 46% increase on where we were before. So the sector has increased demand rapidly, and that means that we need to look at the issue of availability. This is a really hard issue from our point of view, because we know that we have people coming to us saying we want to set up new centres, we want to expand our centres. I could tell you a number of stories of people saying, I want to set up a centre, but in my local government area you can't even apply for development approval if you have more than 40 places. There's another local government area in New South Wales where you can't apply if you're going to use a 2-storey building. Why? I have absolutely no idea. I think it's because they're regulations that have been there and been in place for decades and become outdated. So we know that we need to address these, and you would have seen that we have commissioned Associate Professor Rebecca Ryan from UTS to do a review of all of the planning services to come up with best practice so that we can go to local and state governments and get them to remove the barriers which exist from setting up new centres. But we also know that we need to do more than that. which is why we've announced the grants under the Childcare Accessibility Fund so that local governments can apply for funding to expand centres and to make more places available. And I had the great pleasure of visiting some centres here today, which will have more places as a result of our investment. Of course, we've also seen, and I recently inherited universal access and the preschool reforms which have been made. I know that there was some debate about some of those issues last time when we were here last year, and it was under the responsibility of Minister Garrett, but I now have responsibility for that. And I do think that it is incredibly significant that we have seen, since we invested almost $1 billion to increase access to preschool, we've seen the number of children enrolled in preschool increase from 77% to 89% in 2012. We still have work to do, but these are very real improvements and I think very significant. But I think a really significant part has been the quality journey that we've been on. We have taken huge strides in moving towards a sector which was once viewed as a babysitting service, which was once looked at as being solely to increase workforce participation, to moving to a quality early childhood education and care sector, and a sector upon which we build the policy based not just on workforce participation, but on workforce participation and also access to quality early childhood education, because we know that that is the best way that we can give children the best start in life. And we particularly know that those children who face disadvantage, one of the best investments we can make is getting in early, working with them and having fantastic quality staff. So it has been an ambitious agenda, the quality reforms. Of course, we started with the EYLF, and I know that that attracted a few interesting front pages in the early days. And I know it's something that many of you have been campaigning to do, is to make sure that we can translate that really critical document into other languages. So I was really pleased to advise Leanne that we are today announcing funding, which will see the production of the following materials, that is the Early Years Learning Framework in 10 different languages. I have no idea what these say, but I think it's a really exciting step. But then, of course, following on from that was the adoption of the National Quality Framework. And this is something that we have worked long and hard, that we have worked through the details, that we have negotiated with every state and territory government of every political persuasion. So I don't think anyone should suggest that this was rushed. I don't think anyone should suggest that this wasn't carefully negotiated about how we would transition in each and every jurisdiction. And I believe that it is worth it. I absolutely believe that this is one of the most important reforms that we've made, not just for the children of today, but when we look at our productivity, when we look at the economy of tomorrow, and when we look at the investment that we can make. We've all seen the stats, and I think Sarah referred to the 1 to 17 stat. But I think there is also incredibly compelling research which shows the chances of being engaged in the judicial system as a teenager, of getting involved in drug use, of your educational outcomes, of your social outcomes. Your chance of having a healthy and happy and successful life are massively increased if you have quality early childhood education during those critical early years. So I am very, very proud of the National Quality Framework, but we do know that in order to properly deliver the National Quality Framework, we need you. We need the committed, passionate staff. Now, the Productivity Commission has told us that one of the areas that we need to improve in order to retain staff is wages, that this is critically important, which is why we were so proud to get rid of work choices, to set up Fair Work Australia, to put in place a system where a case could be brought forward. We've seen that in other sectors. We saw it in the community services sector, where we have seen massive across-the-board wage increases and some $3 billion in additional wages flowing to that area. I hope that we see a similar case come forward, and I know that United Voice have recently made some announcements in that regard. I hope the rest of the sector will follow the lead and make sure that we do get a great result across the board there. But we also know that that will take some time, which is why we introduced the Early Years quality fund, because we know that we had to have an initial step while that process was being undertaken. And I understand that we will start seeing money flowing in the next few days from that fund. So I wouldn't count on having too much left, Sussan, because I really hope that we deliver this long overdue funding to the sector. The other thing I would say is we should not start from a place of thinking that people are being paid the same across the sector right now. The campaign that was launched and the protesters I had outside my office and others did on this issue assumed that at the moment everybody was being paid the same, and that as a result of this fund there would be discrepancies in the amount that people were paid. That is simply not true. What we see in the sector at the moment is that we already have staff in a number of centres which are paid substantially more than those in other centres who are on the award. We already see, and I see in my own local community, centres where they have negotiated agreements and they're paid above award, versus centres which are next door and have decided not to follow that lead and not to put up their fees as a result of it. So I think we should just take some of the nonsense out of this debate and say that early childhood professionals deserve to be paid professional wages. Early childhood professionals deserve to be respected, and we will make sure that we find a pathway through to ensuring that that is the case. Now, in terms of the way forward, we have recently announced an increase in the number of in-home care places by 17%. We've recently announced what I think are some really exciting flexibility trials, looking at whether it's extended hours in long daycare centres, looking at teaming up nurses or paramedics or police officers with family day carers who are willing to match their shifts and provide flexible care, looking at extending the amount of out-of-school hours care places and services across Australia. And of course, we've asked other people who have great innovative ideas to apply for funding so that we can look at these ideas now. My view is very simple, in that we have been in government for 6 years. Those opposite have been there for 6 years. 6 years is a long time to come up with policies, to come up with real ideas, and it is not good enough to go to an election and say, trust us, we'll do a review and we'll implement what the review comes up with after the election. I believe that you deserve to know what you're going to get. And I will tell you that under us, you will get record funding for this sector. Under us, you will see a government that is committed to the National Quality Framework, not who says one thing in here, has backbenchers saying one thing in Parliament, and talks about having to have a look at timeframes and maybe we need to look at slowing it down. We need to know exactly what is going to be implemented by the national government of this country. Under us, you will have the assessment of the flexibility trials that we are already undertaking to see what can be rolled out to offer more flexible solutions for Australian parents. Under us, you will have the new trials, those that are applying at the moment. We will have the accessibility grants, expanding the number of places and working with local government to ensure that we make places more accessible. And of course, you will continue to have record levels of financial assistance for parents. I think all of this is incredibly important. What I will say is I believe that we have all worked far too hard to get to where we are, to see any of it thrown around and to see any of us take a backward step. So I want to thank you for the huge steps that we've taken in recent years, and say that I really hope to be able to continue to work with you so that we can continue to improve this critically important sector. Thank you.
Can you just join with me to thank our three speakers before we go to our panel, for those impassioned speakers? I'm now going to vacate my position and hand it over to Bernadette Dunn, who is the chair of our Community Childcare Cooperative. She's going to facilitate a panel, and she's going to push for all of the questions to be answered. So I'll just hand you over to Bernadette.
Good evening, everyone. Excuse me. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet tonight, the elders of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, both past, present and future. I'd like to congratulate the panel on highlighting all of the challenges in front of the sector, and I guess the challenges in front of each party. I'm really looking forward to see and hear how they respond to the questions from Tonia on behalf of the sector, Chris on behalf of the providers, and Sam from the Voice of the Child. So I'll hand over to Tonia, but I'm delighted to say that I felt very reassured that we'll have 3 signed pledges when we close the forum this evening. I've taken that from your opening comments, so I hope I'm not just jumping ahead of myself. So, Tonia, over to you.
I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people on the land on which we meet tonight, and to all Aboriginal people here present. My first question relates to change. Sorry, I'm talking to the back. The sector has gone through significant change with the introduction of the NQF, and most are totally supportive of it, with its commitment to good quality education and care services to children. But now they need time to ensure it's embedded into practice before further change. The sector understands that the NQF partnership is a COAG one, and so change needs to be agreed not only by the Commonwealth but by all the states and territories, and I know the Honourable Member Sussan Lee referred to that. But therefore, how does the Liberal Party intend to achieve change such as those to qualifications and staff ratios when it needs more than the Commonwealth to agree to any such change? And perhaps the Minister, Kate Ellis, and Senators Sarah Hanson-Young could provide advice to a sector that does not want the NQF watered down or delayed in some of its most important features.
I certainly don't want to give the impression that the federal government can act unilaterally, and that's why I did mention the COAG approach. So, as we all know, there is no way that any federal government can unilaterally change what has been legislated in every individual state and territory, and quite differently in states and territories. So what I've said is that I would sit down with state and territory ministers as a matter of priority and look at how things are working. If every single state and territory minister said to me, look, we're 100% happy, we have no issues with the NQF and we're doing it fabulously, go away, that's exactly what I'd have to do. However, I've spoken to 2 state and territory ministers, or 2 state ministers, who've indicated that they would be quite happy to sit down and have that conversation. Doesn't mean that changes would immediately result. It doesn't mean significant change to the sector, because I don't think we're talking about significant change, but I think it's worth having the conversation. As Kate and we've all alluded to, this has been major change. There's absolutely nothing wrong with looking at how it's going and saying 2 years down the track, how are we tracking? What could we improve on? What's working? What's not working? It's as simple as that.
Fantastic. I might just add that, well, I think there's a couple of things. One, we know that there is a review that's scheduled of the National Quality Framework, and I think that's the right thing. I think we should have a look at the impacts in terms of regulations, in terms of a range of different issues, and that review is scheduled to take place next year, and I think should take place as a matter of course, working cooperatively with the states and territories. But in terms of how we manage change, I think the answer is leadership. I know that in the last number of years, when I go and visit a centre, when I go and talk to the hard-working, dedicated, passionate staff members there, you notice that you come across staff members who say, yeah, this is different, yeah, this is a new way of doing things, but we're embracing it and these are the benefits of it. And I think it's really important that we hold up those stories, that we hear those voices and not just the voices of negativity who are good at getting media attention. I think it's really important that we hear the real life examples of people who have gone through the new assessment and ratings, for example. I was speaking to providers just today who were saying there was all this scaremongering, there was all this talk about how hard it was going to be, but actually we found it a much more positive experience and we think it's a huge step forward. So I think leadership is going to be really important, that we hear those positive stories and hear those positive voices.
I think one of the key things about making sure that this reform is has the backing publicly as well as within the Parliament to sustain itself. Obviously, I've talked about the fact that I honestly believe it's got to be, we have to have more funding to make it sustainable. But really it's about, Kate's spoken about the stories of workers in the centre, yes, but I actually think it's about getting the stories of parents out there. I mean, it never seems to sink in when I speak to a parent about the fact that they don't know whether the staff in their centre are necessarily qualified or not. They assume they are. They want them to be. They assume that when they drop their child off in the morning, that the person looking after their child has the best qualifications, because that's what they want to be the case. No parent wants to think that they're dropping their child at the centre, they're paying their daily or their weekly fees, and that the child is being cared for and educated by somebody who isn't necessarily qualified. Parents desperately want to know that the quality of care and education that their child is getting is the best it can possibly be. Obviously, there's a balancing act about what parents can afford and what they can't, but ultimately they want good quality care for their child. And I think family stories about ensuring that it is mums and dads saying, yeah, we do deserve the best for our kid and we're going to do everything we can to do it. And there's a campaign in one of our local communities, the centres promoting the quality reforms by saying, for an extra cup of coffee a week, we're making sure that all the kids in this place, for the cost of an extra cup of coffee a week, we're making sure all the kids in this place have a qualified staff member. I mean, it's breaking it down to that level. And I think ensuring that parents understand that investment in their child's education is worth it. Parents get it. It's about making sure that they feel that that's being backed up by government as well.
Thank you. My second question is about the affordability of services for families has received much media attention in recent months. But my question is not about the cost to families, but the cost to educators working in the sector. Remuneration and conditions are currently unfair and inadequate. We note that to attract and keep qualified staff is critical to the delivery of a high quality service for children and their families. Yet without better paying conditions, this will not happen. What steps will each party take to ensure affordability for families is not at the cost of the well-being and fair pay and conditions for the educators? I've heard the comments about going to the Commission, but I guess the question is more about when decisions come out of that to potentially remunerate and set better conditions for staff, what will the parties do about ensuring that happens?
Well, I think you're looking for a pretty big announcement right there with that question. What I would say is I'm prepared to put forward our record in terms of supporting lower paid workers and ensuring that the government does our bit. And I mentioned in my earlier remarks the community services sector, where we were prepared to put $3 billion on the table to ensure that a sector who Fair Work Australia determined was underpaid because they were predominantly feminised sector got their fair share. And obviously we can't preempt what's going to happen in terms of the case, in terms of the outcome of that. But I think that I would be pretty confident that if you compared records of parties, there is one whose record would stand above the others in terms of standing up for lower paid workers in Australia, and I hope that that's a tradition that continues. That was a very politician answer, sorry, but it's all I can do on that one.
I guess this comes back to my point. If we want to have good quality reforms implemented, we want them to be sustainable. One of those key things is lifting the qualifications of workers and making sure we pay people what they deserve. And we can't keep having a sector that has people, have workers come into it, get trained up, only then to leave because the conditions and the wages are not as good as where they are in the school sector. It's just not, that is not a sustainable way for the sector to operate, and it's not also doing the things that we need it to do. We need to be not just making sure we have qualified people working in our centres, but ensuring that the people who are qualified and are there to train everybody else and have that corporate knowledge and mentor each other. We've got to have a blend of the people who are in the sector supporting each other. The only way you do that is by improving conditions and wages and making sure that it is a sector that people want to be a part of, can afford to be a part of, and desperately want to promote to their colleagues as a sector to invest their life and their careers in as well.
I'd simply say that whatever the Fair Work Commission comes up with is the right answer. That's why we have the Fair Work Commission, to determine what the pay rates should be of the various sectors in Australian society and community. And there's no suggestion that anyone in politics should disagree with those outcomes or not get completely behind them. Look, I'd like to say one thing about the disparity between early childhood and preschool teacher wages, and the fact that we have this continual drain from one sector to the other. We do have to do something about it. What I would like to see, and it's easy for a federal politician to talk about what states should do, but really what needs to happen is that state governments need to pick up the responsibility for paying early childhood teachers from the state education budget. And instead of the agreement that happened around universal access, when you look at the money that went into that, I would have loved to see it actually recognise the difference in pay rates between ECTs and the sector. We're never going to win the argument that we're all on board with, which is that, we've moved so far away from babysitting, it's not funny, and we are early learning educators, if we have this continual disparity where it starts with the university courses. I mean, I've looked through each course in Australia, there's a couple of good ones in my electorate, but basically, the teaching is all aimed at primary school, and if you talk to the lecturers, they don't place students in early childhood, they don't value early childhood, they don't talk it up as a career. So you go in the door to do that university degree, and if you like the idea of early childhood, everyone around you convinces you that when you leave, you should go to primary school. So there's so much we've got to fix up there, and that absolutely does have to happen. And I have some ideas around a campaign that governments should run to really start a change and a shift in thinking and of valuing this particular sector of the workforce. But in terms of the particular case before the Fair Work Commission, it will run its course, and the result will absolutely stand permanently.
Everyone knows that there's an academic institution here sitting that they might want to make some comment around what was just said.
I would disagree that I went to UWS and early childhood.
Well, can we hold it till later? So can you put your hand up later on?
Really committed, and it was a really thorough course. And I felt proud that I was in the early childhood course as opposed to the primary course, because quite clearly I actually was a more thorough course and a lot more sociology and things like that. People from the primary school course that did some of our electives were really shocked at the high standard that was expected and what the marking was like. And I'm sorry, I'm really surprised that would be said.
Well, so that's fantastic that UWS does that, and I'm not aware of every single course in the country, but I've just heard too many examples of the alternative. But that's fantastic, and that's exactly how it should happen. And I spoke to someone today who said, why can't we have, at the end of a specific early childhood degree, a workplace placement that actually helps solve the workforce shortage and pays the student at the same time, which I thought was quite an innovative idea, but again specifically directed to early learning. I think that's fantastic. I just think there should be more of it.
Thank you. Are you ready to move on to Chris? Yeah.
I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered tonight, and I'd also like to acknowledge the work of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people who work with and care for young children. So my question probably follows on a little bit from what you just talked about. As you know, we've got a room full of people here fully supportive of the National Quality Framework and the commitment to improving services for young children. The National Quality Framework, though, is an important first step that I see in gaining consistency of quality across Australia in early childhood services. However, the reality is still that regulations licensing, and more importantly, funding structures still differ across the jurisdictions and service types, and continue to divide the sector, particularly as we're talking about state-funded preschools and Commonwealth-approved services. So my question to each of you is, what big picture plans does each of you have in the future to work with the states and territories to bridge the divide and achieve equity for all Australian children, families and educators?
Well, thank you, Chris, for that question, which we could be here for a while in answering. But I think basically what we're faced with now when we look at the early childhood sector is basically trying to unscramble an egg. I spoke before about when this sector was established. It was established largely based on trying to increase workforce participation. And now we're going, well, actually, this is critical education. So why is it that it's set up so different from the rest of the education sector? Unfortunately, it's pretty hard to reverse that all of the way. And I mean, I think if you want to talk about big picture down the track funding, I could talk about some very different funding models that look more like education funding models and less like supporting parents to get back in the workforce. But I think we are talking about the 2013 election, and I don't want to raise any expectations that I can't meet about what we would be delivering. But I think in terms of where we go, I think it is important that as we increase the education focus, as we increase the quality focus, that we have an understanding of what different types of services are doing. And I think that whilst we've made huge progress within the sector, we still need to do a lot publicly. I think, for example, that people, and I've had a couple of people say to me in the last week that, oh, if you're interested in early education, then you have to get your child out of the long daycare centre and put them into the preschool before they start school. And I think a lot of it is about educating about what it is that people are doing and how those services are changing and how there is a place for those different roles. And trying to then bring that together in a coherent way towards a focus on educational outcomes across the board, no matter what decision that parents make. And the one thing I would say is that whilst we are looking at the fact that the workforce has changed so hugely, I mean, a 25% increase in the rate of women's workforce participation in one decade is extraordinary, and that has a whole range of flow-on effects. It does mean that we have to look at new ways moving forward. But I absolutely believe that no matter what those new ways forward are, they need to be based on both pillars, workforce participation and quality early childhood education. So I welcome Sussan's comments in regards to the nanny debate and the need for regulation and for us to ensure that we have a quality focus on that as well.
I think, well, big picture, I tend to agree with Kate. You didn't quite say this, but I'll say it. In big picture, we should be having universal access to what is an essential service, and that is early childhood education and care. That is if we were being able to go from a blank canvas and paint the picture of what early childhood education and care would look like, that is what you would be doing, ensuring that each family was able to access early childhood education and care, and that each child had guaranteed access to that type of good start and the best start possible. I think that is obviously a long way down the track, unfortunately, because of where we are. But we've seen it start with kindergartens. We've seen the idea of the increase in funding over the decade towards the sector is about encouraging families to take that step. I really think in terms of where we go next with the quality reforms and the question about how we make sure this is not just a hill that we have to climb up to the top and then think, oh, where do we go from here? That this is about ensuring that every child has the opportunity to good quality education and care, whether you live in the suburbs, whether you live in country Australia, or whether you're in a remote Indigenous community. And when you look at the vulnerabilities of children, we know that there's many programs that fall outside the quality reforms, and we have to make sure we're not letting those kids fall through the gaps because it all seems too hard to make that quality standard fit with those services. We've got to find ways of making sure we don't shortchange those vulnerable children, and in particular in those remote communities. So, in terms of the next step, Chris, I really think making sure we don't let those kids fall through the gaps is absolutely crucial, and that's where we should be looking.
Thank you, Chris. I think that big picture, we have to recognise that you can't change culture and people's thoughts from the top down, and I'd like to see a grassroots approach that encourages everyone to value early learning in this country the way they do in some of our European countries. And it doesn't matter how many times the government tells you it's not going to make people change their minds. So I talked about a campaign earlier, that's not necessarily a big picture thing, but if we could work on an articulated pathway that says to a young woman in, say, Year 10, with proper careers advice, and don't get me started on my bugbear of insufficient career advice, but a good quality careers advice that identifies the pathway that can take you from Certificate 3 to Diploma to a really high quality career, and then build on with a degree later on if you reach that point, and actually give you the capability and the strength to say this could be for me. You'd only need a few ambassadors in particularly small rural communities and particularly Indigenous communities to actually really start changing the way people look at the work that we do. So I just think that can't be overstated. In terms of big picture ideas, well, we will have our Productivity Commission inquiry, and I can assure you we'll come up with some big picture ideas. We won't just blindly say yes, 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 because at that point we will have to have a very strong consultation with everybody so that we get your thoughts and your feedback and your ideas. And as long as we keep doing that, I'm not saying the government has the answers, it doesn't, because everybody in this room and outside this room involved in this profession and this sector has all the wisdom that we need when the time comes.
Chris, thank you. Some of you have already touched on this, but I'm actually speaking as a service provider. The sector is really diverse, with a wide range of service providers, large, small, standalone, for-profit and not-for-profit, and there's room for everybody. There is, however, increasing pressure on the community-based sector, particularly when they're in rented premises from landlords, where their landlord is really being forced into a commercial environment with an expectation of return on their assets, particularly through rents. In disadvantaged communities, the capacity of families to pay is not aligned with the full operating costs of a quality early childhood education and care service. It's recognised that there is government funding to support families to access approved early childhood education and care services. However, from a service provider's perspective, it's becoming more and more challenging to keep these services financially viable. Under a social responsibility and leadership framework, where there is importance on advancing the well-being of all children, families and communities, what plans do each of you have to support the growth of early childhood education and care services in rural, remote and disadvantaged communities?
You go. Well, you're the minister.
Well, I might as well make the most of it. Well, thank you. I think there's a couple of answers to that question. One, your question began with the increased financial pressures on community services, and as a result of rents and a range of other things. The first thing I will say is there has been a very alarming trend at a local government level to see local councils making a decision to walk away from early childhood services. And this is something that I think is deeply alarming, because it means that for organisations which have run for years, decades, are now all of a sudden seeing changes at a local government level, saying we want commercial rents to be paid for the first time, that we want an increase here, that we do not see this as part of our core business, which astonishes me every time a mayor says it to me. So the first thing I think we absolutely need to do is we need to have a real discussion about what are essential services in our community. And I just think if you are a smart local mayor and you are looking to attract people to your area, and it is your job to make sure that they have the essential services that they need there, you shouldn't be walking away from community childcare services that you've supported for a long time. So we've been doing quite a push on that. Certainly if you speak to any of the mayors in my area, they'll tell you that I lecture them every time I see them. And I think the reason I raise that is because I do think we need an attitude change about who it is that should be supporting these services, and that we have seen an alarming trend. The other thing I would add to that is that that's why we announced in the childcare accessibility grants, which are out there at the moment, applications closing at 4 p.m. Friday, I believe, that one of the things that we have done is we've intentionally said we need to bring local government into the loop, because we want to make it clear to them that this is a part of their role. So we're saying we'll help provide the funding if it means that we can get local government to stay supportive of a number of the organisations that they have for a long time. So I think that's important. In terms of in regional, in remote, and in particularly disadvantaged areas, one of the things which hasn't probably got a lot of attention because it is quite complicated in terms of the mainstream media, but one of the things that we have seen a massive expansion in government funding for is the JET program, and that is making sure that we can provide for the most disadvantaged, for welfare recipients, that we can provide cheap, very cheap from their point of view in terms of $1 contribution, and the government can pick up the rest of the tab, so that the children that need it the most can have access to critical early childhood education. I think that's really important, and I think through the childcare benefit, making sure that the people that could not otherwise afford to pay have increased support from government is very important moving forward as well.
One of the things that I spoke about up at the podium was in relation to capital grants funding, and I think we do need an expansion of capital grants to be able to allow services to apply for buying facilities where perhaps it's being undercut from under them, just because it seems just because a service is providing an essential service to the local community is not enough to keep the commercial bidders at bay. And I think being able to provide services and centres the ability to shore up by buying their facilities or being able to pay that higher rent is really, really crucial. And if you're a community-based service, where do you get that extra money from? And you're struggling to be able to make the books balance without hiking fees higher and pushing that pressure onto families. So being able to have access to capital grants funding is absolutely essential, particularly when a lot of these services, if you've been around a long time, chances are there's a strong community there, and that of course is why commercial buyers and commercial operators for whatever other type of service start circling. So I think that is crucial. The other option is, of course, on top of capital grants, is an interest-free loan program as well, which I know would be helpful for some services. In relation to being able to bridge that gap to provide viable services in rural and remote areas, I really do think we need to look at a proper weighting for the benefit that's paid to services who offer places in rural and remote areas. I know there's argument for the same in baby rooms, for example, because of the higher ratios as well. So we do need to be finding ways of paying the money that is paid to centres to deliver services is appropriate to match the actual cost of delivering that place to the families that desperately need it. And we should be looking at a weighting for rural and regional areas as well.